Chapter 3. Gloomy Castles and Jousting Knights. Whether rich or poor, young men in the Middle Ages learned how to use a weapon of some kind. Rivalries between nobles, wars with other nations, even violence between neighbors required that they be able to fight. When a lord needed to raise an army, he turned to those he governed. In the Middle Ages, ordinary foot soldiers were trained to fight with an axe and a long spear called a pike. Others were trained to be skillful archers and crossbowmen. Some foot soldiers might have worn chainmail, an early form of metal armor, but most had padded coats and carried daggers. However, the most esteemed soldiers were knights. I forgot to read the big question up here, which says, why was there a need for knights and castles during the Middle Ages? So here we have a crossbowman, and a pikeman. And then here we have a knight in a suit of armor riding an armored horse. Knights were soldiers who fought on horseback and sometimes on foot for their lord. If you wanted to be a knight, you had to be able to afford horses and armor. You also had to find someone willing to train you because it was very expensive to become a knight. These mounted warriors were usually sons of wealthy, influential members of society. Being a knight was one way of making a fortune. If you were involved in successful battles and wars, you might receive money or land as payment for your services. Sometimes a king might also reward you with a title. Having a title usually meant that you were an influential member of society. Knights also made money by looting and by holding certain people for ransom. If you were a knight, here's a young boy training to be a knight, and then down here it says, squires learn to fight with swords. Your training to become a knight begins at a young age. You leave home to live with a family, friend, or relative who has agreed to train you. In the first several years of your training, you help to dress and serve the Lord. You are known as a page. During these early years, as an aspiring knight, you probably learn to use a sword, to ride a horse, and to wield a lance, or long wooden pole with a metal tip. Later, when you are ready to learn more challenging skills, you become a squire. Although you are still a servant, as a squire you are now responsible for grooming and saddling the Lord's horses. You are also responsible for cleaning and polishing his armor. You learn how to fight while riding a horse. You learn to use other weapons, including a heavier lance. This part of your training lasts for several years. If you are a successful squire, you might be knighted by the Lord in what is called the dubbing ceremony. The Lord taps you on the shoulder with the flat part of his sword. Then, a priest might bless you with a prayer. A king knighting a squire. The way of the knight. In France in the 1100s and 1200s, certain expectations about how knights should behave in society were developed. The term chivalry, which refers to a warrior horseman or knight, became the term used to describe these expectations. These ideas of chivalry spread to other European countries. Knights were expected to serve their lord. They were required to honor and protect the church and weaker members of society. They were also expected to treat other knights captured in battle as honored guests until a ransom was received. Sometimes it took months before a captured knight's family paid up. Once payment was received, the captured knight was free to go home. A knight was expected to guard and protect weaker members of society. Charge! Knights could prove their strength and abilities by taking part in jousting matches. Jousting matches were mock or pretend battles between two or more knights. Knights rode horses, wore full armor, and carried lances. Those who took part in jousts did so to gain respect and possibly a generous prize. For the privileged, attending the jousting matches was considered to be a day of excitement and entertainment. It was very much like watching a football or baseball game today. When the joust began, the knights charged at each other. With the aid of a lance, each knight attempted to knock his opponent off his horse. So here this illustration shows that jousting was a popular sport. And then knights competing in a joust down here. Cold, dark, and gloomy. Many kings and nobles lived in castles. Castles provided the inhabitants, or people who lived there, with a certain amount of protection from the enemy. They were also fairly safe places to store weapons and food supplies. The first castles were wooden forts. Later, people built stronger castles made of stone. Modern reconstruction of a wooden castle. Here's a stone castle in France. Castle walls sometimes enclosed a series of small buildings, like a little town. The castle had a water supply within the walls. Residents also needed a good supply of food inside so they could withstand a siege. For added protection, some castles were surrounded by moats. The moat was a deep trench often filled with water. Sometimes there was a drawbridge that could be raised or lowered. Over time, castles became more elaborate with interior courtyards, living quarters for soldiers, and stables. By today's standard, life in a castle was not very pleasant. Castles were cold and gloomy. They were designed for protection, not comfort. Most castles had only a few rooms. There was typically a great hall, a kitchen, and 2 or 3 private chambers or rooms for the lord and his family. There was no bathroom, just a tiny alcove that jutted out of the castle wall. The contents of the toilet emptied into the moat, or a pit directly below. Can you imagine the smell? And this is a castle in England with a moat around it. You can pause the video here for a minute if you would like, and you can look at all the different parts of a castle. Soldiers guarded the walls. There's a gatehouse, a drawbridge. This is the outer wall. There might be a great hall right in here. The lord's chamber, kitchen, keep, and then these are towers. A castle's great hall had many uses. The great hall was where family members and their guests gathered. Meals were served in the great hall. Entertainers performed there, and guests and even servants slept there. Buckets of hot coals or fireplaces provided the fire needed for heat and cooking. Small windows and candles offered little light. Traveling storytellers, minstrels, and troops of actors often visited a castle. Quite often jesters lived in the castle, ready to perform whenever requested. Noble children and adults in the Middle Ages enjoyed music and dancing. They played outdoor sports as well. Tennis, croquet, and bowling all began as lawn games during this period in history. And here, these are medieval musicians. Medieval musings. The invention of new weapons brought an end to the era of knights and jousting. What were these noisy weapons called? Number 2. If a knight dishonored himself in some way by being disloyal or dishonest, he stood trial before a very important member of society. Who would have been his judge? These are things to think about. Here's your letter quest. Find the letter in this stained glass window and record it on activity page 2.3.